The courtroom was already packed when the door opened again, letting in a gust of cold Providence wind and a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a month. She clutched her purse with one hand, her coat slipping from her shoulder, and the other hand held a small child, maybe 5 years old, who clung to her leg like he'd fall if he let go. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven, and she kept whispering, "It's okay, baby, it's okay," even though it was very clear she wasn't saying it for the child. She was saying it to herself. Judge Frank Caprio glanced up from the docket and noticed her instantly. Something about her told him this wasn't a normal morning. She looked like she was holding her entire life together with a single piece of tape. The officer announced her name. Case of Mia Rodriguez, parking violations and failure to appear. Mia stepped forward. Her son, Luca, followed close, holding her coat with trembling fingers. When she reached the podium, she tried to smile, but it collapsed immediately into nervous breathing. Caprio lowered his glasses slightly. "Good morning. You must be Mia." She nodded, almost too fast. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm sorry, I'm really nervous." "It's all right," Caprio said softly. "Take your time. And who's this young man?" "This is my son, Luca." She placed a reassuring hand on his head, though her own fingers shook visibly. Caprio smiled warmly at the boy. "Hi, Luca. You taking care of Mom today?" The little boy nodded seriously. The courtroom chuckled gently, easing a bit of the tension. But Mia didn't relax. Her eyes kept darting around the room, and she swallowed every few seconds as if trying to keep emotions from rising. Caprio opened the file. "Mia, it looks like you have 3 parking violations and a missed court date." Mia nodded again. I know, I'm so sorry. I tried to come last month, but..." She cracked and immediately looked down as if ashamed of the sound her own emotions made. "You don't have to apologize," Caprio said softly. "Just tell me what happened." That did it. The moment he asked, Mia inhaled sharply as though she had been holding the truth in for too long, and someone finally gave her permission to let it out. Her eyes grew glossy, then overflowed in silence. She tried to wipe the tears quickly, embarrassed, but more followed. "I'm sorry," she said again, voice barely audible. "I really didn't mean to ignore anything. I couldn't deal with it." Caprio leaned forward, elbows resting gently on the bench. "What do you mean?" Mia exhaled shakily. "It's just been a lot. I'm a single mom. I work 2 jobs. I barely sleep. I'm behind on rent, my car. It's the only thing that gets me to work, and when it got ticketed, I panicked because I didn't have the money to fix the registration, and then I missed the court date because..." Her voice broke again, and she covered her mouth as more tears spilled. "Because my mother, she was my only help. She passed away last month, and now it's just me and Luca." The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that felt like the entire building stopped breathing. Caprio's expression softened instantly. "I'm very sorry about your mother," he said quietly. Mia nodded, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. "I'm trying, Your Honor. I swear I'm trying, but every time I think I'm getting ahead, something else hits me harder. I'm doing everything I can for my son, everything. I know I made mistakes, but..." Her voice dissolved. Luca tugged her coat gently. "Mommy, don't cry." The little boy's voice shattered the room. Mia knelt beside him, holding his face with both hands. "I'm sorry, baby. Mommy's okay. I promise." But she wasn't okay, and everyone in the room could see it. Caprio waited until she stood again, and when she looked back at him, her face carried a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and something even deeper, shame. "I'll pay whatever I have to," she whispered. I don't know how, but I'll figure it out." Caprio closed the file gently. "Mia, you mentioned you work 2 jobs. What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a cleaner at a hotel, and I work nights at a small diner. Luca stays with a neighbor when I'm gone. That must be very difficult. It is, she admitted, voice trembling. But I have to do it. Luca needs food, clothes, school. I can't fail him. I won't. Caprio nodded slowly. You're not failing him. Mia blinked as if she didn't believe him. Before Caprio could continue, Luca suddenly tugged the microphone toward himself, surprising everyone. My mom is a superhero, he said firmly. The courtroom gasped softly, then melted. Mia covered her face, crying again, harder this time, not because of shame, but because of the overwhelming love she had been carrying silently. Caprio smiled with genuine warmth. She certainly sounds like one. Luca nodded. She works and works and works, and she still reads me stories at night, even when she's tired. He looked around the courtroom with serious eyes. She doesn't sleep, but she smiles at me every morning. Someone in the audience wiped a tear. Caprio looked back at Mia. Is that true? You still read to him after working 2 jobs? Mia nodded, still crying. I don't want him to feel like he's alone. I don't want him to feel like everything is falling apart. Caprio inhaled deeply, moved beyond words. Mia, you're doing more than most people could ever imagine. She shook her head. I feel like I'm constantly failing. Caprio raised a hand gently. Listen to me. You are not failing. You are surviving, and you are raising a child who clearly loves you more than anything in the world. She bit her lip, overwhelmed. Caprio continued softly. Let me ask you something. These parking tickets, what caused them? She hesitated. I parked near my job, I couldn't afford the garage, and I didn't have a sitter, so some nights I had to bring Luca with me and let him sleep in the car while I cleaned inside the building. The entire courtroom collectively inhaled, not in judgment, but in heartbreak. You let your son sleep in the car while you worked? I had no choice, she whispered. I didn't want to, but the sitter charges more at night, and the hotel cleaning shift is the only shift I can get. Luca leaned against her leg proudly, unaware of the weight of her words. Caprio didn't speak for a moment. He simply looked at her the way a father might look at a daughter who had endured too much. Mia, you should not be punished for circumstances beyond your control. She shook her head. But it's my responsibility. Being responsible, Caprio replied, doesn't mean you have to suffer alone. Her eyes filled again. I'm just tired. I'm so tired. I know, he said quietly. For a long moment, the judge simply sat in silence, thinking. The courtroom didn't move. It felt like everyone was suspended in the same breath, waiting. Finally, Caprio closed the file completely. Mia, here is what we are going to do. Her shoulders tensed. These tickets, I'm going to dismiss all of them. Mia froze. I'm also dismissing the late fees, he added. Her lips parted in disbelief. All of them? Yes, he said warmly. Every one. She covered her mouth with both hands as tears poured freely. Your Honor, I don't know what to say. He smiled gently. You don't have to say anything. But she did. She stepped closer to the podium, unable to stop crying, her voice trembling so much the words barely formed. Thank you. Thank you. No one ever helps me. I didn't expect. Her voice gave out completely. Luca tugged her coat again. Mommy, is everything okay? She knelt and hugged him tightly. Yes, baby, everything's okay. Everything's finally okay. Caprio watched them with soft, emotional eyes. Then he said something that nearly everyone in the room wiped their faces for. Mia, you walked in here thinking you were failing, but what I see is a mother who refuses to give up, and because of that, your son will never feel alone. That's not failure. That's strength. Mia cried again harder than before, this time with relief instead of fear. The courtroom fell silent, overwhelmed by the raw humanity of the moment. And this was only the beginning. She left the courtroom that day with her arms wrapped around Luca and a small plastic bag of paperwork that suddenly felt less like a sentence and more like a rope she could climb with someone holding the other end. Outside, the air seemed colder and somehow gentler. Providence moved around them, traffic flowing, people hurrying, but Mia walked like someone who had been permitted to breathe again. She told Luca they would get lunch at a small diner nearby, nothing fancy, and he nodded as if the promise of a hot sandwich was the same as a victory flag. While they walked, she cradled his small hand and let the warmth of it remind her of why she had endured so much. She thought of her mother, of the funeral last month, of the empty chair at the table, and the heavy quiet of the apartment at night. She thought of how she had crawled into the car with Luca, feet numb from exhaustion, and read the same picture book for the third time as the diner lights reflected off the windshield and her shoulders trembled until she pretended to be okay. The memory was sharp and awful, but now, after Judge Caprio's words and the dismissal of the fines, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like someone had opened a door she could step through. The next morning, Mia did something she'd not allowed herself in weeks. She called her sister. The voice on the other end, at first distant, then full of surprise, then warmth, made her realize how much she had shrunk into herself. She told her sister, in halting sentences between sniffles and suppressed laughter, about the courthouse, the little boy who announced his mother's superhero status, and the judge who had looked at her like he saw the whole truth at once. Her sister cried with her and promised to drop off a casserole and some diapers that weekend. Practical things that made the world less sharp around the edges. After the call, Mia felt something shift. There was a practical relief in knowing family could help in small ways, and a deeper change that came from being seen, called out of the fog by another human who had chosen kindness instead of judgment. At the hotel that night, she walked through the revolving doors and felt the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of lemon cleaner. The mop handle was heavy in her hand. She had always liked the quiet rhythm of a cleaning shift. There was a meditation in it. Sweep, spray, wipe, repeat. Her supervisor, a tired woman with kind eyes named Rosa, greeted her and said, "You look lighter today." Mia smiled, and for a moment the smile was not an automatic mask, but a real thing that rose from the inside. Luca's face floated into her mind, his small, solemn nod in the courtroom, the way he pressed his small palm against her cheek when she'd been too exhausted to sit up straight. She worked with a steadier breath, thinking of the new balance she had to create. Not a life of extravagance, but one where small mercies could be arranged. Between bed sheets and trash bags, she began to sketch a plan. Re-register the car, find a daytime sitter for a cheaper rate, call the local church to ask if they had small emergency funds for families, and maybe, only when she could breathe a bit, look for a community program that could help with utility bills. Word of Mia's case, like all human stories told in public, has a way of rippling. In the days that followed, a woman who had been in the courtroom and had cried quietly in the back reached out to the municipal court's social worker, who in turn told a small circle of volunteers at a neighborhood assistance group. One volunteer, a retired school teacher named Eleanor, arranged for a bag of groceries and stopped by Mia's building after calling first. She stayed only 20 minutes, sitting on the steps while Luca chased a small bird across the sidewalk, but she left more than bread and milk. She left a business card and a note. "Call if you need us. We have volunteers who will watch children 2 hours a day to help parents catch up." When Mia read the card that night over a bowl of soup, she felt the room become bigger. The note had been small, but it contained a promise she had forgotten existed. People sometimes choose to help others, not because they must, but because they can. Inside the courtroom, Judge Caprio filed Mia's case away in the quiet manner of a man who has seen too many lives stack up like files, and yet never quite stops feeling the weight of each one. He returned to his chambers and thought about the mother and the boy who clung to one another in the way that makes strangers want to fix the world.
He told his clerk to contact the municipal court's outreach coordinator. "Keep an eye on that family," he said, not because the law required it, but because compassion operationalized sometimes needs a practical nudge to become help. He remembered his own youthful days of scarcity and the teacher who had shown him a sliver of kindness that had redirected his life. And there, in the polished oak quiet, he made a small plan. Speak with a local nonprofit he trusted, ask the social worker to check in, and make sure Mia got information about rental assistance programs before the month's end. For Caprio, a dismissal was not simply a line in a ledger, it could be a point of departure. News of Mia's moment in court seeped into the neighborhood chatter, and within a week, an online neighborhood group posted a note about the brave single mother. People commented, offers of used winter clothes, a slow promise for a baby stroller someone no longer needed, a church youth group offering to tutor Luca so that Mia could pick up an extra shift without worrying about homework. The responses were small mercies, each modest on its own, but together they began to weave a safety net. Mia, at first overwhelmed by the kindness, felt slightly suspicious. Who offers things without a catch? But day by day the calls and messages continued, gentle and insistent, and she realized there were many people in the world whose tentative generosity could be as life-saving as a single sizable donation. She learned to accept without shame, because refusing the help would be to refuse the community that had decided, in that moment, to care. The weeks that followed became a choreography of small, practical steps. Mia called the DMV with help from an elderly neighbor who wrote down questions for her, and she found a payment plan for the car's registration that would allow her to spread the cost over months. She registered for a community childcare co-op that matched low-income parents with volunteer sitters for certain shifts, and Rosa at the hotel shifted Mia's schedule slightly so that Luca could attend a free after-school program during certain afternoons, and the diner manager, grateful for her steady presence during late-night shifts, allowed a few more consistent hours when the child program needed a parent to pick up. For the first time in months, her calendar had a little less screaming red and a few green ticks of possibility. With each small adjustment, Mia felt the pressure relieve, not evaporate. Grief and exhaustion remained, but now there were tools and people to help balance what had been crushing alone into something manageable. Luca's school noticed changes too. The teacher, Miss Patel, sent home a note that said, "Luca is thoughtful and kind," and mentioned how he had been helpful to a classmate who had been nervous about reading aloud. When she read that at the kitchen table later that night, she pressed the paper to her chest like a papery shield. She began to make the 15-minute walk to the school hill with a new spring that was careful but true. Sometimes she would arrive with a tired face and a small donut for the weekly classroom party. Sometimes she would smile and slip into the back of the PTA meeting just to listen and feel like a neighbor, not a defendant. Her presence, once frayed, started to feel normal again. The neighbors stopped lowering their eyes when she passed. They greeted her with, "How's Luca?" instead of the awkward silence that had accompanied too many of her desperate mornings. On the nights when grief still flooded her like tide water, the nights when she would sit on the edge of Luca's bed after she tucked him in and replay memories, the last conversation with her mother about grocery lists, the smell of coffee her mother used to make on cold mornings, the way a laugh from the television used to stitch small warmth into the apartment. On those nights, she learned an important skill: to let herself grieve in measured ways and then set the grief gently aside to make room for the living. She began attending a neighborhood support group once a week, where others spoke of loss, of the pressure of single parenthood, and of the small victories they celebrated. The group was full of practical people who traded tips and recipes and babysitting swaps, but they were also people who knew how to listen without advising, who made space for tears and then passed around tea. In that circle, Mia found a kind of strength she had not realized needed cultivating, the ability to ask for help and accept that everyone has limits. Months went by and the seasons changed. Providence's leaves browned and fell, then returned green and hopeful. Mia's schedule solidified into a workable rhythm. She still worked late cleaning shifts 3 nights a week and the diner at odd hours, but now she had a reliable after-school program for Luca and weekend help that allowed her to catch up on rest sometimes. She started setting aside a small envelope each paycheck, a modest safety cushion that in her mind was a promise. Not riches, but a little breathing room. Luca flourished in tiny visible ways. He learned to tie his shoes, to count to 100 with a bright earnestness, and he made a friend in the homework club, whose mother was also a night worker, who knew how to braid ponytails and pack lunches in the dark. The two boys built a tiny kingdom of forts and secret handshakes inside the community center, their laughter stitching new light into the afternoons. Despite the progress, there were still moments that stung. One evening, as snow threatened, Mia opened her mailbox and found a late rent notice. The old panic rose like bile. She felt the familiar hot flush of shame, but this time, instead of sinking into the old helplessness, she called the nonprofit that had visited months.
The calendar on Mia's kitchen wall had become more than a tool. It was a diary of small victories. Each little check mark, each circled date, each scribbled reminder was evidence of how much had shifted since that morning in Judge Caprio's courtroom. The air in her apartment even felt different, less like a place she survived in and more like a place she lived in. There were mornings when the sunlight slanted across the floor and she would pause, holding a cup of coffee, surprised by how soft the edges of her days had become. Grief still lived quietly in the corners. She still thought of her mother whenever she folded laundry or cooked rice in the pot her mother had gifted her. But now grief accompanied her, like an old companion, not an enemy waiting to swallow her whole. Luca was taller now. It happened slowly, then all at once. His legs stretched out of his pajamas, and his face began losing the softness of early childhood. He had started reading on his own, and sometimes she would catch him whispering stories to himself, his voice low and sweet in the dim living room light. He had become the kind of child who noticed everything. The wilted plant on the windowsill, the tired look on his mother's face, the scratch in her voice after a long night shift. He began asking questions that halted her mid-movement. "Mommy, do all superheroes get tired?" She would smile and kiss the top of his head and say, "The good ones do, but they keep going." It was during one of these gentle mornings that an envelope arrived in the mail. Thick paper, official seal. She recognized the address immediately. Providence Municipal Court. Her heart beat faster. For a moment she feared some overlooked fine had resurfaced, some clerical mistake threatening the fragile order she had built. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. But instead of fear, a wave of surprise washed over her. Inside was a letter, not a summons, not a notice, but an invitation. The city was hosting a community event in partnership with the municipal court, celebrating local volunteers, small neighborhood heroes, and people who had overcome difficult circumstances. They wanted her to speak. Specifically, they wanted her to tell her story, the story of that morning, of rebuilding, of resilience. She read the letter twice, then a third time, and finally pressed it against her chest, overwhelmed by the strangeness of being asked to stand before others, not in shame, but in pride. She wasn't sure she could do it. Public speaking once felt like an impossibility. Even speaking to a neighbor used to feel like squeezing her voice through a small crack in her ribs. But she showed the letter to Luca, and his eyes widened with excitement. "Mommy," he said, "that's because you're a superhero." And she thought, if her son believed she could do it, then maybe she could. The weeks leading up to the event were a mix of hope and nervousness. She practiced reading parts of her speech while washing dishes, while folding laundry, while riding the bus to her evening class. She wrote her story down, then rewrote it,
then stared at the crumpled papers, wondering how to tell something so heavy without drowning in it. But each time anxiety rose in her throat, she remembered the courtroom, the warmth in Caprio's eyes, the softness in his voice, the way he had spoken to her like she was not a case number, but a human being. The day of the event arrived with cold wind and clear skies. Mia dressed carefully, simple black pants, a clean blouse, her mother's thin silver necklace. Luca insisted on wearing his lucky shirt, a blue one with a tiny stitched rocket, and he held her hand with the same fierce protectiveness he had shown the day they walked into court. The building where the event was held buzzed with voices, laughter, and the clinking of plastic coffee cups. Volunteers from local shelters chatted with firefighters and teachers. Families gathered around tables covered in brochures and pastries. At the front of the room, a small stage was set with a podium, and standing near it, talking quietly with a group of organizers, was Judge Frank Caprio. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him to be here. She knew the event had been organized with the court's participation, but she hadn't imagined standing face to face with the man who had, without knowing it, changed the course of her life. Caprio noticed her at that exact moment, as if his instincts were tuned to the presence of people he had once helped. His expression shifted, recognition blooming into something warm and tender. Mia's feet felt suddenly rooted in place, but Luca, fearless in the way only children can be, tugged her forward. "Mommy," he whispered loudly, "that's him! That's the judge who helped us!" Caprio smiled and opened his arms slightly, as if welcoming an old friend. "Mia," he said gently, "you look well." She swallowed, tears gathering far too quickly. "Your Honor, thank you." Her voice trembled and she felt instantly embarrassed, but Caprio shook his head. "No tears today," he said with a soft smile. "This is a happy occasion." But there was something in his tone, not dismissal, but encouragement, a reminder that her tears belonged to the past, not to the woman she had become. He crouched down to Luca's height. "And you've gotten taller." Luca nodded proudly. "I'm 6 now, and I'm really good at reading." Caprio's eyes sparkled. "I knew you would be." A moment later, the event began. People took their seats, and the host introduced Mia as a mother whose story reminds us of the power of community and compassion. The applause rose like a wave. Mia's palms grew damp, her throat tightened, but when she stepped onto the stage and her eyes found Luca, small legs swinging off a chair, smiling at her with absolute faith, something steadied in her chest. She began slowly. 2 years ago, I stood in a courtroom, terrified. Her voice wavered. She inhaled. I was overwhelmed, exhausted, grieving, and convinced that I was failing as a mother. A hush fell over the room. I thought I would be judged. Instead, I met someone who saw me. She told them about the tickets, the sleepless nights, letting Luca sleep in the car while she worked, and the shame she carried like a stone in her pocket. She told them about crashing into tears at the podium, about Luca calling her a superhero through his small, sobbing voice. She shared the way Caprio had spoken, softly, respectfully, without pity, but with understanding. She described how that moment had opened a window in a suffocating room. And then she told them everything that had followed. The volunteers who arrived with groceries, the neighbor who helped her call the DMV, the community childcare program that allowed her to sleep, the support group that taught her to breathe better, the scholarship that let her take classes, the way her life had shifted from barely surviving to quietly building. She ended with a sentence she had rehearsed many times, but which now flowed freely. I